we're a bit lucky because Holly and Mariah come out of media, so they're having fun like that.
Toot.
Thank you for coming this afternoon. I know most of you, if not all. My name's Holly Cobia. I'm honored to serve as your Chief Advancement Officer for the college. And we want to start by thanking our student group here. It had to be 3 for lovely music. Thank you. And, you know, this is a really important conversation this afternoon, this evening, I guess it is, we're rolling into. And I know a lot of you have been taking time to get to know our new dean, Richard Blythe, whether it be, you know, some one-on-one sessions with him, or if you went running with him recently, or had coffee with him. And so creating some opportunities for some great conversation and getting to know him. And this is the first of what will likely be several dean discussions in the coming months. And of course, this one kicking off with Changing University. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our dean to introduce our special guests for this evening.
Thank you, Holly. Why don't you join me just one more time to thank this fantastic student band. It had to be three. This is a Beyond Boundaries conversation, and it's our Beyond Boundaries conversation. So we're now asking the question, what are we going to do in that space? These guys are quintessentially Beyond Boundaries. They're three students from three colleges, is that right? So they're already Beyond Boundaries. What we're going to do today, I've lined up three people to take three different kinds of looks at what the future of the university might be for us, particularly in this college, in that future space, the future context that Beyond Boundaries projects universities into. This is a very important thing for us to consider. So I'd like to welcome all of you, my colleagues, to that conversation, and all of you, because there's a bunch of them down there back in Washington joining us from SPIA. It's important that we all grab this conversation as our conversation. We're going to take three looks at what that future might be. One, a look through the eyes of what future economic states we might be able to produce that we could use the university and work from the university to try and bring into being. We're going to look at the idea of complex big projects and begin to imagine how we could begin to inhabit that space as an ecology, as the university as an ecology that joins into other ecologies outside the university itself as a change agent, as a bringer of change to other places, but at the same time to completely transform who we are and what we are as a university. How can we do that? This is the question we're going to start to explore tonight. And we're going to look at what that might mean in terms of the sorts of disciplines that we do that are very much practice-based in all the sorts of disciplinary areas that we work, from the fine arts through to policy and planning and government, through to architecture and landscape architecture, and of course our wonderful colleagues in building construction. We are all somehow engaged in that sort of practice space. So I thought, how can we have a conversation with hundreds of people? It's very hard, so this is slightly artificial. I apologise for that. But I thought this might be a way that we can, slightly artificially have a real conversation between all of us. And I thought, so what we need is a couch. We'll do conversations on the couch with the dean, I thought, and then someone, might have been Holly, said, Richard, you can't do that, that's OCD. But I thought, well, we need a couch, we need a good couch, and I know just the guy to get us a good couch. Bill, come up here. So, Bill Green, ladies and gentlemen. We know Bill. I've known him less. It's fantastic being in your 50s and being new, but I've known this guy for less time than most of you, but I love him already. He's fantastic. What I absolutely love is his passion and fascination for objects. So I said, Bill, can you get me a couch? And he got this couch for us, especially for this set of events.
Hello?
And then I said, let's get some objects. So Bill, tell us about, what have we got here?
Well, we just tried to put together a collection of things that would, look appropriate, and then also, their culture. It's material culture. It's things representing our aspirations and our interests. And the couch is partially inspired by Richard's jacket. Turn around. Yeah.
You didn't tell me that.
I didn't tell him that. But this is by Charles and Ray Ames. It's 1954. If you look right in the big front window of the Ames house, there's one of these couches there covered with a zebra skin. But anyway, and Jack says that he saw it there the other day. And this is a coffee table by Isamu Noguchi, the great Japanese-American designer who tried to be Japanese but ended up very, very American, lived in Brooklyn. And that's a lamp, an Ikara lamp by him. Most of this stuff is from the 1950s, except that chair there is by, officially by Corbusier, Pierre Jeanneret and Charlotte Perrin, but it was really pretty much designed by Charlotte Perrin, who was working for Corbusier at the time and a real talented furniture person. And I had to throw in an Alexander Calder print. It's a silk screen there. And this thing is 1895, designed by Christopher Dresser, one of the very first practicing industrial designers. He actually called himself an art consultant, but he would design anything: ceramics, wallpaper, furniture. Didn't make any difference. And just to keep us humble, this is my most recent acquisition for the collection. This is a Taino Indian Zemi, which is a god figure from, this particular one is from the Dominican Republic, but we were all watching the hurricane in Puerto Rico, and the Taino culture was definitely in Puerto Rico as well. And I've got a textbook about Taino art here. The Taino Indians were the most talented of the Native American stone sculptors. Very interesting on an island that you could become a stone sculptor. But have a look at this thing up close if you can. And you can look through my textbook, but to be honest with you, this particular one is nicer than any of the ones in the textbook.
Bill,
So,
let's give
Richard?
a round of applause to Bill. Thank you so much, mate. So it is important for a college that has so much design in it that we really consider the design environment that we're in. So it's fantastic that Bill has been able to set this up, and wonderful that we have these kinds of objects. I threw this one on the table just to bring a piece of my past history. This is Tom Kovac designing for Alessi. So that's and there's a long story about this which I'll tell you all another time. But okay, so we're going to start with looking at economics, and for us as a university, the big double whammy, which I've been speaking to many of you about, is this massification. More and more students expected to come through universities, 800,000 more students in universities today than there in the US than there were 10 years ago. And that's ramping up, not down. The second element of that is state de-investment in universities. So at the same time as there's increasing expectation of numbers, decreasing investment. So what's Beyond Boundaries doing? Well, Tim Sands has set up an amazing strategy to try and look at alternative sources of income. But what we can start to do is to try and imagine, well, what are alternative economic futures? And to do that, I've asked Ralph, our very own Ralph Hall. Please give it up for Ralph Hall. We had some great conversations about, welcome to the couch.
Thank you.
Ralph.
Yeah.
Grab a seat, mate.
Exciting.
Is this how you do it? Oh, I'll sit down with you. So I wanted to ask Ralph to come in and just project out for us, when we're talking about economies and future economies that give us different kinds of options. What might they be, and what is the economic problem as you see it, Ralph? Tell us about that.
So I'm going to try and cover a lot of ideas quickly, so forgive me if I don't explain everything in minute detail. When I was looking at this idea, I was reading a New York Times article about Enric's work, and I think there was an analogy there about architecture being the seed that you plant in a local context, and that flourishes and can transform an area. So I was thinking about, well, what is the challenge, the local context that I'm particularly interested in, and what is the seed of change that can change that context? So I'm going to talk about two ice hockey stick. I said hockey stick the first time we were talking about this, and field hockey sticks are basically a straight line with a nub, so we were very confused for a while. But ice hockey sticks of trends that I think are very important to understand. And then the seed of change, which I'll touch upon, is something that we're working in SPIA called the Beloved Community Initiative, and I'll come to that. So the first ice hockey stick curve is the climate change curve, right? So you see the deviation from the mean about plus or minus half a degree, and then industrialization comes along and you have this tick up. So now we're trying to keep the change in temperature below 2 degrees. Maybe we can do 1.5, we'll just have to see. But this curve is also sort of an example of many environmental curves that we could draw. So I read a while ago that there's enough brominated fire retardants now out there that killer whales are fire retardant. So this is a big problem, right? So, we need to fundamentally address what we're doing in an environmental context. The other hockey stick curve is inequality. We basically have a flat profile, and then that ramps up at the end. And if you look at what's happened really since sort of 1950 until today, if you think about labor and wages as a share of GDP, it's sort of fluctuated from about 65 to 60% for many decades. And then around the year 2000, it went on a 45-degree sort of downward slope. And so now we're somewhere around 55%. At the same time, with the loss of GDP going to labor, where does it go? It goes to corporate profits and capital ownership. And that's gone up at an equal rate. And there's estimates out there that from about 2000 to about 2014, wage income lost about $750 billion. And I would estimate that today being probably near the trillion mark. So earning income is a losing battle to a certain extent. And so what's driving that? Well, there are many reasons, but one of the sort of most talked about reasons today is displacement of jobs through automation and a new digital economy. And so you've seen this polarization in the workforce. So you've got now highly skilled, high-paid sort of parts of the continuum growing. You've got the middle set of the economy, middle-class jobs being undermined by automation. And it may not be that the jobs are necessarily gone, but what happens is the value, the productivity is being done more by automation and capital and less by labor. And so you have that dynamic. And then you have growth in the sort of service economy, food services, that sort of thing, which aren't as well paid. So you have this growing inequality. And these are these sort of tidal force-like currents that we have to address. And so what's really problematic is when you put these two graphs together, right? So I do a lot of my work's in sustainable development, in history of sustainable development. And today the strategy is to pursue a green economy, is to pursue essentially a decoupling of growth in GDP from growth in environmental pollution and pollutants. And so the current way to do that is through efficiency, through advanced technology. That's sort of the way we're looking at that, which at the same time means efficiency in doing vast amounts of work with less, which has an impact on the labor force, right? So the solution to the environmental problem could be a disaster to a certain extent for income inequality, addressing that. So I've been thinking about this for probably more than a decade now, and I've sort of come to the conclusion that we have to rethink how the economy works. I think we really fundamentally have to look at what we have, recognize the trends which are growing and in negative ways, and to think about having an income from your wage, but having also an income from owning capital. People talk about a universal basic income as another idea. And that's sort of the research around that led to a project proposal for a MacArthur grant, 100 and change proposal, where you apply for $100 million to do something. And so I recorded a video where I described an approach which could give people ownership of capital, so they could have labor and capital income. And that was watched by a colleague of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who worked with him for 10 years and said, I tried to convince Dr. King to essentially finance his economic dream agenda using this approach. And he worked with the original authors of the approach. So that's the foundation. That's the seed of the Beloved Community Initiative. And now we're
how we could rethink it. And
yep.
Of course, we're in the economy. As a university, we're in the economy. We can't be outside that. We can't imagine our discipline outside it. We're in it, and we're in the environment. So we're stuck with that.
Yep.
Ralph made it very personal to me. He said, Richard, universities are relying more and more on students paying for their education. Yes, they are, Ralph. Well observed. He said, how are they going to pay for it if their wealth through wages keeps falling the way it is? And that's absolutely true. So even for our own self-interest, we should be interested in these things. So I'm going to invite my second guest to the stage. Please welcome Enric Ruiz-Geli.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we shuffle along.
Yes, yes.
So
okay.
Enric, many of you will know he's a world-class architect, absolutely amazing thinker in all sorts of spaces. He owns patents, he's done world award-winning buildings, but he's also worked on quite complex projects, and he's worked on projects in Barcelona, where they have looked at trying to develop new kinds of economies, and they've embedded that endeavour within a housing regeneration, school regeneration kind of system. So, Enric, tell us about those kinds of complex, difficult projects and your experience of working within them to try and do this kind of thing. So in a way, you pointed, he's kind of done a version of a seed. But tell us about that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Richard. Great to be here. I got this. I think I belong already to the family, right?
I tried to make them all Hokies on the way in.
I have this. And Ralph, thank you for reading also this article on the New York Times. That was quite something for us to be able to be like publish like 6 pages and being like 40 years old. And it's true. It's true. I agree with you fully in terms of how the economy is framing the work today. At the same time, construction is still #1 economy. 28% of global GDP, construction, building. That's why buildings are #1 cause of global warming too. So we have this kind of double agenda there to keep on jobs, green jobs, as you mentioned. So Barcelona, about 14 years ago, tried to build this district of innovation. And it was meant to be a way to retrofit a part of the dead city. So based on the industry of textile industry back in the 70s. Of course, Catalan industries were sold in terms of innovation, and this territory has been dead in terms of economy, employment, but the residents and the citizens were there too. It was a socialist mayor 14 years ago that said, look, there's maybe a new industry, this economy of knowledge industry, maybe. At the same time, it was a push, this idea of social housing and headquarters of great companies together, 50 meters away. So it was impossible agenda, Silicon Valley and social housing. You agree, no? It's impossible. We agree? Well, when you go to Google headquarters and Apple headquarters, you don't see social housing. Social housing are in a ghetto, as we do it in Barcelona too, in the 80s and in the 90s. But this was a socialist dream. Socialist in the sense of social activism. Not politically speaking, but social activism. So this neighborhood has geothermal and brings energy from the sea. We have the sea in front of Barcelona. So our building is connected to the sea, sends water to the sea cools my water, I don't use AC, the building is a net zero building, 70% of it digitally fabricated, 108 Arduino sensors in the scheme performing to make sure that the building is a net zero at a market cost, because then the architects nearby will complain I have more public funds than them. That's the bigger question. You have to stay in the lecture later to get all the details.
Okay.
Yeah. That was a bit of marketing, a little marketing. So when the people working on that office look through the terrace and they see the sea, they say, thank you to the sea. Thank you to cool my building. And this is what Jeremy Rifkin talks about, the civilization of empathy. So when I am working on this building and I live with 10,000 euros a month, I can say this to Washington, people there live with 600 euros a month, too, the social housing people. And we both go to the same sharing bike station. And we meet and we talk. So that is this kind of impossible glue where architecture is the glue of society. And there is this discussion. So how was your day? How are your kids? So how are you going to create employment? Well, I'm working on it. Do you understand? It's this social situation where architecture has a very powerful game and responsibility towards innovation. The other thing I saw in this neighborhood, which I was doubting a lot about it, is this economy of knowledge. So for the first time, you start to see buildings where 1,000 people work there, and they don't have gas, they don't have oil, they don't have uranium, they are not mining, they don't have sources. So what do they have? Knowledge in a new format. For example, rights. There's a building with 800 people working to protect the rights of 25 writers. You see? 25 people writing poetry or literature, and then 800 people as a new industry of rights. I think you are very advanced in the States about this, but for us it's a very new agenda.
And also in that building, Enric, there's a very nice connection. The lower floors are public floors, public education. The next floor is a pitching floor where people can come and pitch ideas. Yes. The next floor is a startup floor. So as you pitch your idea, if you get a backer, you go to the startup floor. And then the top floor, they're investment bankers on the top floor who come down a couple of floors to see if there's anything interesting going on. So it's kind of like building a little mini ecology.
Yes, yes. What's interesting is there's the students in the in the audience.
Yep.
Okay. So basically, as soon as these students start to produce a group of research together and so on, what's also happening is that as soon as they got the title of architect, they leave the place, right? So what we want to make sure is that they don't leave the place, that we incubate them for 6 months in this building so that that neighborhood, that relationship, that kind of a startup mood starts to operate. They do startups. There's some seed capital there. And of course, they are, let's say, cheap because they are starting. And owning 20 or 30% of their company is a great investment in that moment.
And part of the Beyond Boundaries vision is to think about whether we can create a kind of innovation district like that on the campus here. But let's move on now because we're talking about projects.
So that's kind of the big complexity.
We're talking about ideas. We're going to have to shuffle along. It's going to get cozy. It's going to get cozy now. Okay. And I'm going to introduce my next guest. This is Marcelo Stamm. Please give him a warm welcome, a hokey welcome. Marcelo, I've had the pleasure of knowing for about 15 years or more now, run into each other here and there, and then we've worked very closely together for the last 7 years or so, looking at this thing of practice-based research and a different way of thinking about how knowledge is generated, where knowledge is generated, how you extract that knowledge, and how you do that in that kind of project arena. So this is very important for us in terms of this link between economics, projects, and then how do you bring that into a university system, which is not just doing the research, but also how you bring that into learning generally. So Marcelo, do you want to say a few words about...
Yes.
Just a few. Marcelo is a philosopher, so you have to...
Beware.
Have some boundaries.
Pointing out that I'm a philosopher, I thought I should share with you 3 lines. This is why I'm the only one who's got this text, a little text with me. I found it only a few days ago, and I think it's an extraordinary text. We're trying to think in terms of new economies, new ways of thinking about projects and challenges into new spaces around university and what research and practice research could be in it. And here I found a text by an eminent Anglo-Saxon philosopher, by the way, who actually marveled and thrived at Harvard. This he wrote in 1928. And so this is 100 years back, only 20 seconds. This is about the university, and then you'll see why I'm giving you this gift. The universities are schools of education and schools of research, but the primary reason for their existence is not to be found either in the mere knowledge conveyed to the students or in the mere opportunities for research afforded to the members of the faculty. Both these functions could be performed at a cheaper rate apart from these very expensive institutions. Whitehead, by the way, is the author of this, says books are cheap, and we could add today the internet is extremely cheap. So the justification for a university is that it preserves the connection between knowledge and the zest of life by uniting the young and the old in the imaginative consideration of learning. Just think about that formula. Uniting the young and the old in the imaginative consideration of learning. I think that's an extraordinary formula, almost 100 years old. Now, how can we imagine the university of the future in terms of practice-based research? That's, as it were, now this part of the pitch. Why? Because an extraordinary sequel of, as it were, paradigm shifts, or you might say turns have occurred. Many of you have 40 years ago witnessed perhaps the linguistic turn, then came the digital turn, then came the medial turn about social media that's only sort of 10 years old. And then another turn occurred, which is the so-called practice turn, that people started to understand we don't actually leverage, we don't capitalize, we don't understand that in practice there is extraordinary wealth of knowledges, and these knowledges are somehow embedded and embodied. There is experiential knowledge in all of this. So there's practitioners. Here, this is a room packed with practitioners, teaching practitioners, practitioners which have practices of all sorts of kinds. They might be creative practices, they might be practices in all sorts of other. So don't think of a practice, you might be really an extraordinary full-fledged academic, and there may be then this teaching practice, which is a practice as well. Okay, now, what the idea about practice-based research is, we might have to think in very different terms how we get into understanding what these kinds of practices are. And if we connect this to the problems that we've just heard about, for example, the whole complexity of the situation that we might face in, say, not 10, not 15 years, but maybe in already 5 years' time, things might have changed incredibly with regard to what kind of student do we have to, as it were, what kind of student do we have a responsibility towards? And what kind of, people used to talk about skills that students would kind of have. Maybe we have to think about what kind of agility, adaptive, transformational agility do students have to have in the next 5, 10, 20 years' time. There, one of the important things is to think about practice research, researching into the practice as people that we throw into these what are extraordinary complex situations. You might call them, and there is a whole discourse around this, and many of you will know, emergent complexities. That's a completely new way of thinking about this. And the problems that Ralph was pointing at, these situations that in big projects that Enric will present also in his lecture, these are exactly these kinds of paradigm cases of emergent complexities of extraordinary kinds. How do you engage with them? You engage with them, thrown into them, that's almost a picture, and then these agents, you ask them, report back what you experienced when you, as it were, got your hands dirty in this. Of course, this means to reinvent also types of knowledge, types of what does it mean to understand something of these complexities. It's no longer the, as it were, orthodox way of understanding things. There's new genres, which is what would an emergent explanation be? What would be emergent knowledges, plural? This is not only knowledge, knowledges, confluence of intelligence. So there's an extraordinary task there. For that, you need, if you want to do this kind of practice-based research, you need, of course, ways to do this, methods to do this, toolboxes with interesting new ways to make that implicit knowledge explicit. There is tacit knowledge, you want to voice it. You have these kinds of hidden pieces and you want to make them visible. All these kinds of things. That, I think, is in these terms of Whitehead in 1829, namely, the university as that place of an imaginative unity of the young and the old. That's that kind of space.
So here's a kind of a concept, a proposition emerging from this about what the role of the university is, what it can be for, also what it can do. You know, can it be part of the seed, the transformational generator? Can it be the sower of that seed? Can it be the agent of realizing that seed? Can it work at all these scales, from economies to social concerns to environmental concerns? This is a very beyond boundaries picture, actually, not that we've dragged that out of the beyond boundaries strategy. It's just, that is why the beyond boundaries strategy is there, because this is the condition that we're finding ourselves in. So I guess the question on the couch is, what can CAUS do? I mean, we're a very interesting faculty in that space. We have a long history of doing projects, for example. So many of you are sitting there saying, yeah, well, we do projects. You know, we do solar decathlon projects. Jack's, I can see Jack somewhere. We do libraries in Maui. Like, these are projects. So we have a history in that. So we should be able to draw on the knowledge that we have about how those things operate. But I think what we're doing here, particularly by bringing Ralph in and our SPIA colleagues to say, well, okay, but what about the policy environment? What about the social equity issues associated with that? Can we bring that into? Can we make some meta big projects that we don't go off and do in our own studios, but that we set ourselves like a 10-year goal as a team?
Yeah.
And we say, within this bigger project, sure, there's going to be dozens and dozens and dozens of smaller projects that we're all going to be working on that might be part of that. But could we set up this project ecology where we're searching for those alternative economic models, wondering, throwing it in to the complex soup that I use simpler words like soup, and seeing what happens there, seeing what our students find in there. Also, not being afraid to jump in ourselves. Let's not be faculty who let the students jump in, but we don't jump in. Let's jump in there with them. And maybe we'll need the students to help us get back out, but we'll work that out as we go along.
Yes.
And can we partner with communities, with governments, with institutions, corporate institutions, with the World Bank, whoever will partner with us? Could we partner with them to try and make projects? And I think that address some of these critical questions. And probably the university is one of the few places where, in a neutral way, you can ask kinds of difficult questions about the economy, and we can do that in a depoliticised way, if there is such a thing. So what do you think? Is this...
Yes.
Yes.
We are on board.
We can go to drinks now.
We are on board. Just to add a bit on this. These are our studios and these are our offices, and I had the chance to see this case study in Barcelona as this kind of big district changing. Of course, global warming is another scale. Of course, corporate architects, designers are working on this scale, on master planning, on city scale, but no one is on here. Really, really close to the scale of global warming, in the sense of looking at the atmosphere, looking at the rivers in India, pollution. If that is the bigger, complex system situation and scenarios, and we have, in terms of university, the knowledge of the engineering and the designer and the human and the economist, the diversity that is empowering the university, I would like to take you there. I would like Virginia Tech to do these big projects because, seriously, Deloitte are not there, the associates are not there, and it's urgent to have projects there. And so if you have knowledge capital here and the big questions are there, let's get there.
So we're gonna move to some questions, and we're gonna throw it open to you guys as we go into this. But I'm going to ask the question that I guess, as your new dean, I'm asking you, and we asked this directly at the WAC yesterday. So we're asking them in there too. Just three things. Should we be interested in that practice-based research, practice-based knowledge, the immersive learning kind of spaces that we're talking about? Should we be interested in that? Should we be doing that? The second question is, should we be interested in trying to, in some way, formulate these bigger projects and to create a space where we as a bigger team, and bringing some of our colleagues from other parts of VT and from outside, tackle some of these projects over an extended time frame to try and build our way into some of the big issues that we all face, but our colleagues in other places face. And to think about that, I like to think about that in the Ut Prossum context. How is it we can bring some service to that? So, and then the third question is, should we, because we have a set of, in many ways, very, very good degrees. We don't want to mess with them too much, right? So I'm not, just so you're all clear, I'm not thinking that we mess up everything that we have and try and turn it into this. I'm thinking of a third space outside of the things that we're currently doing. Can we make a third space where we begin to experiment with these things? And then our existing programs can begin, as they would like, to join into parts of it or to borrow parts of it. But should we be interested in those things? So they're the three questions I have for you. You don't have to answer that right now, but let me throw it open. Do we have some questions? You can also, of course, just ask these guys some questions while we've got them there.
I have a question for Ralph Hall.
Yeah, let's go. We've got some mics here so that we can even it up a bit.
I have a question for Ralph Hall. I think this thing is on, right? Yeah. You mentioned this idea of capital being spread out and the idea of a minimum income or basic income. Try to explain exactly what that means, because that's an intriguing idea which I'm unfamiliar with.
I'll respond with a challenge to Enric. Right? So, I mean, think about it this way. You have a building, if I understand it, with a venture capital entity on the top, financial investment place, and then you have sort of a structure there. What's missing from, I think, this view is the money flow, right? And so I think it'd be really interesting to think about when those VCs invest in the up-and-coming ideas, they will have a stake in what's created. And so this concentration of wealth that we are seeing is partly happening because those that are able to invest in the creation of new capital end up owning that capital. And so one of the things that is very interesting to think about is what would happen if there was a structure in place in this new community where eventually the ownership, the dividend payments from this new entity that's created goes to the whole community. It's just shared, right? So you could it's basically a corporate finance strategy. I won't go into the details, but a colleague of mine, Robert Ashford at Syracuse University, wrote a book on the theory of binary economics from Lewis Caus's ideas back in the 50s. And so there's decades of thinking theoretically about this, but what's missing is a real test case. And that's where I'm looking now to try and find somebody who's interested in creating this seed of change to say, even if it gives everybody a few cents a year, it could work. And then the idea is you scale that across the economy and you finance investment in corporations in a way that distributes the end ownership of them. So you can do it that way, or you could do it through a universal basic income and redistribute via taxes, right? Which I'm not a fan of, but I like the idea of giving people a claim on the future growth that's coming. And then they have an income stream from that. Now, the other piece of this is what do you invest in? So what I would like to see, and I've had a lot of debates with my colleagues about this, is targeting the future growth on inherently sustainable goods and services.
Yes.
So you fund those and you don't fund, so you can have dual systems of investment, right, going on. But there's this new entity that's essentially funding sustainable development as we'd like to see it. And then the returns on that investment go to the community around where the businesses are. I mean, how you structure that is a big question. There's lots of big questions here. But I think if you begin to have an income from outside of your labor, it opens up a range of possibilities. It gives you this place where you can maybe take more risks, right? Because you have you know you're covered. So innovation might actually go up, and that's what we found in some studies. So that's one area. There's also just enabling people to pay for education, for example, because they can, you know, at the moment, who applies to Virginia Tech, for example, you know, if the wages, if not the wages, but if the tuition keeps going up and the costs of just going to university keep going up, we're not going to have students across the continuum.
So let's bring it back to projects for a minute, and I'll come at it from
we agree.
two directions. One of them is I've talked over the last 8 weeks. I've been meeting with many of you doing these funny spider diagrams of what you're talking to me about. And a number of you, I've had some fantastic conversations with faculty who are very interested in this idea of establishing experimental practices within the institution of the university itself. And I think there's enormous potential and richness if we think about those practices not as the individual sort of studio of someone practicing, but we look at it in the bigger picture of the kind of multidisciplinary big practices that we see now. in many of the disciplines that we operate, and we start to say, could we build practices like that operate with this kind of premise? So in the practice is the economist, is the urban designer, spatial designer, is the environmental engineer, is the ethics philosopher thinking about what does this mean in terms of how we're understanding knowledge. I'd be interested to hear what you think. You know, are there people here who are thinking, no, we don't want to do that, or are there people thinking, actually, no, that sounds like that might be something that would be worth getting into? Nobody. All right, so we go home.
I can make perhaps a helpful comment. This Whitehead formula says uniting the young and the old. Of course, the young and the old can mean many things. I just want to draw your attention to this little word, unite. We have a fantastic, historically, politically powerful formula. This was Marx who, a long time ago, said, proletarians unite. And it meant actually something extraordinary, namely he understood. This has nothing to do with whether you like Marx or whether you don't, or whatever. It's nothing to do with Marx. It's about this word to unite. Yeah, it's about the idea if you bring things together, then it's actually wrong to say that the sum of the parts is more than the parts. It's not the idea that it's simply more. It's not adding horsepower to have 2 horsepowers. That's not to unite. To unite also in that old sense meant if you bring these together, yeah, the sum, yeah, the proper translation of this formula was not is more than the parts, but is different to the parts. It's not just a quantitative addition, but actually if you bring the economist, the urban planner, the ethicist, the neurobiologist, the whatever, the botanist, if you bring these intelligences into these new spaces of these complex emergencies, then there's a new sense also of, it's no longer interdisciplinarity, it's not a supradisciplinarity, it's not cross-disciplinary, whereas we've reached the transdisciplinary phase. Yeah, we went through all those prefixes, as you know, yeah, in all these academic debates. So, but the idea of all of this is we need to understand that the confluence of these intelligences creates not simply additional, but it creates new, completely new ways of understanding what the questions are that we should ask. Mm-hmm. And so one of the extraordinary innovative challenges for universities is actually to replace standard questions, well-rehearsed questions, habitual questions, by actually completely new, or let's say even only be modest, slightly better questions. And already that contribution to society is in that imaginative space. We've been asking these questions for 2-3 decades. Somebody then in these kinds of new ecologies, in these ecologies of innovation, comes up with this question we didn't ask before, and this question can propel the stuff forward.
So I'm going to carefully, as the chair, ask another question, but if someone wants to jump in, just let me know. You can have the floor. I'm going to ask Enric. So you've been involved in projects that are big, that are complex, that have some of these big picture ambitions. How do you go about setting it up? Give us a picture of, you know, if you're asking people, would they like to join such a thing? What does it look like? How do you constellate? How do you create a team that does something like that?
Yes. We have to look at long term, but at the same time, long term not meaning 30 years from now, because that's, but it's not 2 years from now. It's this kind of 6 to 10 years. I think if you look at expertise, we are gonna need about 100 to 120 different skills. That's kind of the picture of a big project. The scale of the big projects are related to situations. When you go to United Nations, when you go to UNESCO, you just knock the door and the list of big projects they're dealing with is big and is huge. So that's really a source of looking at different agendas. At the same time, employment or the way it's being built, our habitat. I think the solar decathlon is a very good example here of already something which I would call a big project. If their agenda is to perform a performative passive or house for that event, then it's not a big project. I think what they are doing is to produce a knowledge and a technology based to really consider a new habitat, a new spread city, a new urban scenarios. So where technologies are there, where there is more patents than studios, where in a public money project you produce patents at the same time, and then you do the building, knowledge base. So I would very much look at how the university operates, and instead of having everyone in their own agenda, which that builds a very interesting deep knowledge, have people aligned to a certain target. And this is how complex systems produce a lot of added value, if they do operate aligned. And I think it's a way we did the Olympics in Barcelona this way, like that was the dream, and we all got aligned to it, we all participated somehow. So these are kind of the big projects.
So if we imagine that we had that kind of setup, we had our 100 people in different areas,
yep.
We're working on this, and in our conversation, we've been stuck in a car together for 5 hours, and we spent all yesterday and breakfast talking about these things with various alum from Virginia Tech, and we were throwing around this question, but what would the big project be? We've sort of pointed, maybe it's a UNESCO thing. There's something about maybe we should be taking care of thinking what are the economies of the sorts of things we're looking at. And we talked about a couple of projects. One, and these are just examples, they're not ones we're necessarily going to race off and do. And one point made this morning was probably, if we're looking at big projects, we should look in our own backyard first.
Yes.
These ones are not necessarily in our backyard, but taking that on board. One big project, for example, would be if you're looking at infrastructure. So we have the destination area, intelligent infrastructure for human-centered communities. It's the longest name I've ever heard. So anyway, we have one of them. And I was talking to one of our alum, he's a terrific guy, John Eisen, who he's been in a couple of really interesting conversations there. He said, look, I just got back from South America. We went down there, it was part of a philanthropic project he was working on, looking at the problem of infrastructure in those cities, which now that's an interesting problem, right? You've got a city of millions of people, the population's growing quickly. Already the infrastructure doesn't cope. There's not the capital there to just throw at it to fix the problem in a technological sense. So here's a really complex problem where your opportunity base is to say, okay, well, we can't just think about hard infrastructure because we can't achieve that. So how could we begin to think about catalytic soft infrastructure projects, human infrastructure projects that can begin to then regenerate how the city builds itself? And of course, we can come at that from, that could be a project that we worked on for the next 100 years, maybe. So this would be one example of what, and when you think around that, of course, it has all sorts of construction implications. It has all sorts of policy, planning, governance kinds of questions. Of course, the economic questions, the physical questions, and then the community questions. So this is something like, and then Enric was pointing out tell us about India and rivers, Enric.
Well, 2 weeks ago in Mumbai, meeting with the government, they are very much, of course, scared of the amount of pollution they have in their city. They are picking, I mean, we were there wearing masks, and we are picking at 100, 180, some days 380 in Barcelona. When we are at 80, we are freaking out. And they are at 380, okay? So the government is looking at, well, these are our big problems, are the pollution of the river. We have these 5 rivers, and send us a fee proposal. Do you understand? So how do we calculate a fee proposal as an office? Okay, let's talk to Arup. Let's call Richard Rogers. I have some green other architects, but it's not going to happen. we are not going to give enough knowledge and value to this situation. On the contrary. So that's why there is this gap, this scenario, this solution, where 1,000 faculty, students, researchers are probably the answer to that. If they do operate aligned, if they do cooperate quickly in the next month, no. But again, not in 2050. In a 10-year scenario, that's the timing they have. That's the timing global warming is giving us.
And we were talking this morning about, should we be concerned with those kinds of distant projects, or should we be concerned with Southwest Virginia? Should we be, what should we be concerned about? But then you look at certain realities, like in some of those South American cities, and certainly in a number of the Southeast Asian mega cities, 40 million plastic bottles a day are used, and they don't go anywhere. Well, they do go somewhere. They go into the ocean, right? So, and we now have those big kind of pools of plastic floating around the ocean. So, yes, some of those projects are remote from where we are, but they are actually in the food we eat, right? So they are also, this is why these big problems are becoming local problems, not just distant problems. So I think there's fascinating territory that we can talk through as we try and decide collectively what projects would we collectively, what would we like to look at, but also what kind of value can we bring to other places, other people, what kind of service can we offer into those spaces that can try and reach for these kind of seed conditions that can be catalytic in changing the way the communities work.
These are real projects, Richard. These are real projects. To talk big projects, we immediately think it's an abstract condition, but these are real projects. And the learning curve of a student when he gets to practice and theory and the making and the experience of being there and the experience of the polluted river in their hands and listening to the communities there, and that's the learning curve. At the same time, empowers the team and the big project again. And so that is a way that you are doing these projects, but you are also learning from doing these projects. So that's what we learn in the District of Innovation. It empowered. So it was not this theoretical framework, just that, no. And the real thing.
And in all our conversations so far, and I think you will agree, we got the impression we are addressing a new generation of students, because university is about that space. We're talking about a generation of students that has different perhaps to a student 40 years ago or 80 years ago, of course different in different situations. Just about everybody agrees this new generation of young people, they have almost an intrinsically genuine sense of social. So there's these tensions there. And so then the question is, how do you engage an 18-year-old with that impulse to somehow, I want to, in a sense, make a contribution, or I have a sense of responsibility that goes beyond the gadget that fascinates me all the same. And where would that be? And there was a sense that if these young people might immerse themselves into, at their level, with perhaps some trajectory where they scale up into responsibilities and they get this kind of ownership that into these kinds of projects.
So there's 100 of us working on it, and then we're throwing the students in there too, and they're with us as colleagues searching for...
In that community.
Ralph's this is going to be the last question, because I'm looking at the time and I understand that we are now standing between you and the drinks that are next door where we can continue the conversation, and that's a very dangerous place to stand. So, Ralph.
Well, I was thinking about the library design project, right, that's happening.
Yes,
so we're designing a library. There's a number of colleagues actually in this room and about 20 students that are working on a library design for a university in Malawi. But it's really a fascinating project because it's a project about capability. It's about putting thinking about how to put a capability into Malawi that could transform not only the university but the whole region in terms of how things work. And the type of things we're thinking about are how could we put into this space a sort of maybe a data visualization, analytic, learning capability, which we also implement in a future global systems science building here at Virginia Tech. So we have sort of sister facilities, and then the students here can go out and work locally with maybe students from Africa in the room virtually thinking about how do we solve this problem here, and then vice versa. So it's building projects or thinking about projects that put capabilities in play that were previously not in play. And then if you start thinking about how you could use this kind of collaboration space in a teaching environment and in a research environment, you've got vector disease control issues, you've got climate change, you've got physical infrastructure building. I mean, so that's what, so the library is not just a building with books in it. It's really much, much more than that. And the challenge, we've challenged the students, and Jack and his colleagues have challenged the students to think in this way. And so it's sort of the beyond boundaries destination area discussions have enabled faculty to connect. And it's this sort of connection and just bouncing ideas around. And you know, it's really fascinating to see there's much more connectivity today than there was 5 years ago. And so now the question is, what do we do?
How do we take this forward?
Keep that going?
So we've got some evidence of seeds, we've got some evidence of projects, we've got some thinking around what this means from a research point of view. Can we really now do this at a bigger scale again and bring the university as a in a way as a tool into that space in new ways? I'm not going to stand any longer between you and drinks, getting far too dangerous now. So can I ask you to join me in thanking very much Ralph Hall, Enric Ruiz-Geli and Marcelo Stamm for this conversation. Please, if you're busting and bursting with questions, let's get into those over drinks next door. We'll do that for about 50 minutes, looking at my timekeeper over here. And then we're going to come back in here, and Enric's actually going to show us some of the work, because I think it would be, while we've got him, let's have a look at some of that amazing stuff that he's been doing over a long period of time. So thank you very much for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Pleasure.